This Scottish-style castle would be an ideal setting for a Charles Dickens or Jane Austen film. But it isn't in Scotland. It's not even in London. This is New Zealand. The first owner of the castle, William Larnach, was born in Australia, but his ancestors were all Scottish.
That came to New Zealand in 1867, and he was an entrepreneur, and he made a lot of money in the 1870s, and I think he really wanted to show off his wealth. He had a very successful uncle who was a banker in England, and he wanted to emulate that uncle. He wanted to be on par with him.
The castle, which took 12 years to build, brought the family no happiness. Larnach's wives and children all died one after the other. He was made bankrupt and committed suicide, but the castle still stands. It's now a visible confirmation of an amazing phenomenon. In the 19th century, settlers from Europe flooded into New Zealand, bringing with them a whole world of materials, everything from plates to trees, and over 2 centuries, they completely changed the face of this land. Endless beaches and hot rivers, where you can swim even in winter. Mountaintops and giant kaura trees. New Zealand has many of nature's treasures, and people once discovered one more treasure: gold. The Maori always knew there was gold in these mountains, but they had no use for it. The settlers from Europe placed great value on the metal. Australian geologist Gabriel Reid was the first to strike it lucky. In May 1861, in this unassuming ravine, he picked up a big gold trail. In just a few months, workers panned so much of the precious metal that prospectors from all over the world flocked to Otago. The country's gold rush had begun. It's the same old story. Mine owners capitalized the gold while the diggers lived in poverty, in miserable hovels built of stone with minimal amenities. The gold rush only lasted a short time. By 1865, Otago's gold reserves had already run low. Many gold mines did continue to operate, but without great profit. The site of one has now become home to a museum. Nobody knows just how old this ancient sluice box is, but it still works. There is still some gold here in these mountains. Everyone has a chance of finding some. I've studied the technique for gold panning, and now we're going to try it for ourselves. Pick up a cup and go for gold. There's no need to hammer out the rocks. It's already there by the spade. Fill a bowl with stones, take it to a spring, and swirl the rocks in water. Because the gold is so much heavier than everything else, the lighter particles should be washed away, and that leaves the heavier ones down at the bottom. The grains of gold should stay there, and if there are any, that's where I'll find them. Not everyone gets lucky, but we did. Look carefully. So after 30 minutes of work, here they are. 2 little grains. They're shining. New Zealand's gold didn't just make its way into people's pockets. The gold rush provoked explosive economic and population growth on the southern island. Near the gold diggers' villages, on the shores of Lake Wakatipu, the city of Queenstown developed. Paddle steamers plied the lake carrying meat, wool and other supplies. A railroad stretched to the ocean from the other end of the lake to carry all the goods out to the seaports. Grant Craig is a senior attendant at Dunedin railway station. In just a minute, the train is arriving. Grant meets it personally. In the late 19th century, Dunedin was considered the capital of South Island. Here is where New Zealand's first university appeared. It was also a financial and trade centre, which is why the city has such an unusual railway station.
When railways ruled the roost, you know, there was no airlines, there was no buses, no coaches. Railways was how you got there, and so you had to have a magnificent station to show how wealthy the city was and how important railways was to the city.
There are many railroads in New Zealand. They link almost all of the country's main cities and once played a key role in the economy.
To open the country up was the main reason that they started building railways. New Zealand was such a young country and they needed to open up the countryside for settlement. So they built railways dating, and they started in 1862.
Travelling in New Zealand is a real pleasure. But even today, getting to it isn't so simple. The flight from London to Auckland takes 24 hours. But in the 19th century, the same journey could take half a year. What prompted the settlers to take such an arduous voyage? Every family has its own story. Robin Macmillan owns an antique shop in Rotorua. While there are no customers, Robin shows us photographs of her ancestors.
My mother's and my father's family came into New Zealand quite early in the 1850s. This is my mother's family, and this is my father's family from Northland. This is my great-grandfather, John Macmillan, and he married my great-grandmother. She was a Mackenzie.
Robin's paternal ancestors were Scottish. The authorities had deported them to Canada, but the harsh climate and hunger made them go even further.
They built 6 ships, sailing ships. My Macmillan ancestors were shipbuilders, and they shipped to New Zealand, and they applied to the New Zealand government for a block of land where they could all live together in their religious community.
Robin's maternal ancestors came because of the gold rush. Her great-great-grandmother ran a hotel for prospectors, and her grandfather drove a cab. They dreamed of a better life, but never realized those dreams.
He died on the road, I think, one night in a really bad blizzard. There was some very, very bad weather through the original gold rush period. The winter was terrible. People froze on the gold fields, and I think it was probably through that time period, he was caught in a really bad snowstorm and he died with his coach on the road.
New Zealand today is one of the wealthiest countries in the world. Robin has confidence in the future, but in the 19th century, things were very different.
And I think for them, doing what they did is like for us going to outer space, really. It makes me feel more connected to my place in the world and my place in New Zealand.
Robin's husband, Martin, is a guide in the famous Waimango Volcanic Valley. We went there with him. Straying off the wooded paths in the valley can be dangerous. It's quite easy to fall into the boiling mud. There are hot springs everywhere, feeding the streams that flow into the lakes, and a constant cloud of steam above. Geysers are the favoured entertainment for guests in the valley. The Lady Knox geyser in Rotorua erupts every day, promptly at 10:15 in the morning. The secret of that accuracy is quite simple. A little soap is placed into the geyser's crater.
One of the geysers that we had here in the Waimango Volcanic Valley was the Waimango geyser. And from 1900 to 1904, it was the largest geyser in the world. So about every 36 hours, it would erupt to around 1,000 feet. And we're seated in that geyser basin now. So you can imagine a geyser where we are erupting up to 1,000 feet.
In ancient times, the Maori saw Volcanic Valley as a place of danger and avoided coming here unnecessarily. But all that changed when the settlers appeared.
And these days in Rotorua, we have a couple of spas that are there for helping people to help with, especially arthritis and rheumatism, because the heat helps ease the pain.
The first complex like this was built in the early 20th century for an English queen. The monarch never actually came to Rotorua, but many of her soldiers wounded in World War I did appreciate this resort after being sent here for treatment. It's now an architectural landmark in the city, a symbol of free natural heat providing prosperity for the whole region. How was life for the first settlers? You might study historical documents and read textbooks, or just try on a first settler's costume.
Good afternoon, sir. My name's Mike Gray. I'm your tour guide. But an interesting thing happens. You see, when I lift my hat, I become Alexander McMaster, and the time is 1884. Yes, this is where we are, in Oamaru in 1884.
There are no boring tours here. Our guide tells us the story of Oamaru, in the role of one of the city's first locals. In the 19th century, this was a big commercial port, where rail and sea routes converged.
A nice place for a coffee today, even a sandwich. But in 1884, this was a grain store. Have a look at the stunning nature of these buildings. Very grand facades.
Just streets and houses. But Mr. McMaster's costume somehow makes it all seem brighter.
Well, I have a question. What are these spikes doing on the windowsills? Here's a set here without a pot plant. Well, I'll tell you what the answer is. There were sailors that came in on ships. There were farmers that came in from the country. They're all men. And what happens is they're looking for a good time. So what do? They get drunk, they smoke, they swear, they have fights. The end result is the townsfolk get fed up with them. They put spikes on the window to stop them sitting on the windowsills, and eventually prohibition is brought in.
The port is closed now, but life still goes on. Former warehouses have become trendy shops and restaurants. More and more tourists are visiting Oamaru, all keen to immerse themselves in the past and pay their respects to the ancestors who developed whole cities from scratch.
I really have enjoyed being with you, and thank you for coming on our tour. I look forward to meeting you again. And now I'm back to being Mike Gray. Thank you.
The settlers didn't come to New Zealand alone. They also brought domestic animals: horses, cows, sheep and fowl. New Zealanders like to joke that there are 70 million of them, including the sheep. I know for sure that there are 4.5 million humans in the country, so all the rest are sheep. What's more surprising concerns the grass that feeds all the livestock. That too was brought here by the European newcomers because the indigenous grass was inedible. Diana Medjin is famous in New Zealand as a horticulturalist. She knows everything about the plants that came here with the people. The Maori were hunters and foragers. They planted exotic-sounding vegetables like batata, kumara, and taro. Everything else came from nature. The settlers brought with them very different lives and behavior.
The early settlers were very interesting because the British planned, the English planned for this city to be a slice of old England. So from the aristocratic top, if you like, the wealthiest, the most well-to-do, to the labourers.
The Maori quickly learned to grow the potatoes and wheat that the settlers had brought and went into business selling produce to the cities. The settlers rapidly established orchards with seeds they'd brought with them or purchased through mail order, which sometimes didn't go to plan.
My friend, who also has right back early settler ancestry, her great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather ordered onion seed from New South Wales because everybody needed onions. But an onion seed is very, very fine. So he opened the bag and he planted his rows of onions, and they were all eucalyptus.
Trees too played a role in New Zealand. Many cities, including Christchurch, built typical English-style parks for sociable strolling and leisure. Diana takes us to an oak tree with a unique history. Queen Victoria had it planted in 1863 in memory of her beloved husband, who died quite young of appendicitis.
And she went into mourning for the rest of her life. And she sent all her colonial governments an acorn from the royal forest. One of the royal forests. This is the acorn here. So it's just a small acorn. This is the seed of the oak tree. And she sent that to each of her governments in each of the cities, the capital cities, and they distributed them to various of their botanic gardens in New Zealand.
Many introduced plants soon broke away from the parks and gardens. See how the mountains are overgrown with pine. The settlers experimented with different evergreen varieties and found that Californian pine gave the best results. In New Zealand's mild climate, it grows rapidly. The trees are felled and the timber sold abroad, mainly to China. Then the mountains are replanted. A cycle that swells New Zealand's coffers.
In California, it's quite a straggly, small tree. But when the seed was brought here, it grows, it's become our staple export tree and our staple timber tree.
The first settlers achieved a colossal undertaking. They drained bogs and broke ground. Crossing New Zealand, you rarely do see European landscapes. Before the Europeans arrived, the Maori had no alcohol, but the newcomers had become accustomed to wine over thousands of years. Inevitably, they brought another plant to New Zealand, the grape. French missionaries founded this winery in the mid-19th century. Preachers were among the first to move to New Zealand, to Christianize the pagan Maori.
And they arrived here in 1838 and they brought with them everything that they had. So they had their own food, they had vines, things to grow their own food, etc. And they actually set up a missionary about 10 kilometres from where we are today.
We know nothing about how effective the Frenchmen were in their evangelism, but they were hugely successful at winemaking. New Zealand enjoys a mild and warm climate and good soil.
Back in 1851 was the first time that they had an overproduction of what they were producing. They had more than what they needed, so they decided they could probably sell a bundle of wine, make some money for their own purpose, and then redistribute that through their missionary work. So we have the first recorded sale of wine in New Zealand, which was in 1851, and that's why we can claim that we're the oldest winery in New Zealand.
Officially, New Zealand is a Christian country, but many of the church buildings have closed, and this missionary house is no exception. The winery, though, is still going. It maintains and develops wine-growing tradition in New Zealand. Stories about the early settlers are far from remote and forgotten. New Zealanders do remember their ancestors, and sometimes those ancestors provide their own reminders. This amazing story took place in Bonds Bay Village, in a house belonging to the local teacher, Harry Brittenden. He bought it 40 years ago as a student, and the house soon started surprising him.
I began to wonder who lived in this place. And as I cleaned out the hay and tidied it up and started to renovate, to rebuild, all these clues came up. I would find old bottles like this around in the garden, or an old shoe from a child, and I wondered what child had that. So I asked the neighbours, the farmers.
Harry was excited by the finds. The house was alive with shadows of the past, and one day, Harry noticed a woman with a camera near his home.
And I said, "Why are you taking a photo of this house?" And she said, "My grandmother was born here." And I thought, wow, a connection to the history of this house. And so I said, is your grandmother still alive? And she said, yes. She lives in Christchurch. So I said, could I possibly go and visit her? And she said, yes, come and visit my grandmother. So it was then that I met Ivy.
Thanks to that chance meeting, Harry was able to restore the house's history. It appeared that Avi's Danish grandparents had built the house. They sailed to New Zealand in the 1860s, fleeing the war between Denmark and Germany.
Ivy told me the first year they were here, they were given a sail from the ship, the sailing ship. The first tree that they dropped, they put the sail over, and that was their home for the first year while they built this house. Every board on this house was made by hand, was cut by hand. And the amazing thing is, and can I just grab this? This is one of the original boards.
Harry was so impressed with Avi's stories that he wrote a book about the first owners of the house, as well as other Bonds Bay settlers.
I think when I first bought the place and I cleaned everything out, and I could see the wallpaper, and I'd find these bits and pieces like this, it felt like I was living in somebody else's house, and it felt like I was like a intruder. But as I've fixed it up, the inside I completely redid. It became my place.
The first settlers earned their daily bread from the sweat of their brows. Their descendants left their mark on world history. One of New Zealand's best-known sons is a famous scientist, the father of nuclear physics, Ernest Rutherford. This is the Rutherford Museum in the University of Christchurch, where the young Rutherford studied. He later moved to Cambridge and became a world-famous scientist. He often trod on these steps going into the university. He sat at this desk listening to lectures. Perhaps it was here that he decided to continue his education in England, in Cambridge. New Zealanders achieved various heights, both scientific and mountainous. This statue commemorates one of the most famous New Zealanders, Sir Edmund Hillary, the first person to conquer the world's highest mountain, Everest. British nationals were the first to colonize New Zealand. But as the years went by, people from other nations also went to the country, including Russians. One of the biggest Russian communities lives in Auckland. Here we see a Russian choir singing a Maori song, a sign of respect for the first people to discover New Zealand. Here there's true Russian spirit. It even smells like Russia. The owners of this unusual house are the Kolanov family. Everyone's hungry after the trip, and the lady of the house has everything ready. It's fungus tea, a popular trend here in New Zealand too. It has a Japanese name, but I can't remember what it is. It's fungus tea. We drink it in Russia and here. Life in Russia was far from stable in the 90s. To avoid risk, the head of the family brought his wife and 2 sons to the very end of the earth. The boys, Yevgeny and Grigory, are grown up now and both have their own families, but they constantly visit their parents to help with household chores. The Kolanovs have a large plot with a forest, their own winery, and even a spring, where the brothers like to wash after work. Here, near the stream, there's a real Russian sauna, made of Siberian pine. Close by is a wooden cross made from the native tortora tree, which nobody can find these days. The tortora doesn't decay, and the first settlers felled every tree. These fences belong to the farmers. In some places we repaired them, in others we made changes and kept some back for good things. We placed this cross to mark the start of our religious development of the place. This cross played a special role in the Kolanovs' life. Previously, in Russia, they simply lived. But here, among the Kiwis, as the New Zealanders call themselves, a thought took root. Who are we? Locals or strangers? That thought provoked unexpected results. Here in New Zealand, the Kolanovs reconnected with their Russian culture. They built this fairy tale-like house, the cross by the spring, and a wooden temple, which matches the best examples of northern Russian architecture. I feel relaxed and at ease here, but I don't feel like a local. People often ask me, since when have you lived here? Well, from 95. Oh, you're a real Kiwi for sure. I say no, I'm Russian. Overall, coming here, after a long time outside of Russia, he helped us to systematize many issues. What homeland means, what being Russian means. He helped us see things in a new way. This small temple sums up the family's sacred quest. Yevgeny became a priest. He and his brother Grigory organized summer camps in Bonds Bay to introduce children and other New Zealanders to Russian culture. I'm very glad that I live here. I appreciate everything that New Zealand can give me and does give. First, the conditions for me and my kids. But I brought to this country a part of my culture, a part of my personality. It's like you. You came here 160 years ago, but didn't become Maori. You brought your own habits, your architecture, everything, and created your own little England here. We do the same. Time never stands still. In the past, it was the English and French who came to New Zealand, and now the largest inflow comes from India and China. The type of immigrant has changed too. Where once there were farmers and poor people, now there are students, businessmen, and the technical and creative intelligentsia. New Zealand has a rich national image. High standards of living and ecology are attractive to people. This prosperous land, though, still depends on Mother Nature's moods. Looking at Christchurch from a bird's eye view, you see large gaping tracts of undeveloped land here and there, right in the heart of the city. Christchurch used to be the most beautiful city in New Zealand. It resembled Old England, but in February 2011 it was almost completely destroyed by an earthquake. These houses are among the few that still look like the old Christchurch. One of the city's biggest losses was this cathedral, the leading place of interest in Christchurch. the walls couldn't withstand the aftershocks and partially collapsed. More than 200 people died in the Christchurch earthquake. The city's very future hung in the balance. Many thought it shouldn't be rebuilt because it lies on a fault line, and a catastrophe could strike again.
New Zealand gets somewhere up to 13,000 earthquakes per year. So it's constant, and that's how it got the name the Shaky Isles, because there seems to be constant earthquakes.
But time went by, and life reasserted itself. And the city does live. It's full of bright young faces. It has a future. They say that the population has returned to pre-earthquake levels, even a little higher. Hopefully, everything will be restored. The city will live. Once, the early European settlers produced wealth for the country. They built roads and cities, developed agriculture, shared their experience and knowledge with the Maori, showed them the benefits of civilization. Modern residents owe a great deal to this capital, but they don't fear challenges. They actively encourage them. New Zealand is still open to new settlers, and positively benefits from their experience, knowledge, and skill.